Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. Today is going to be a different sort of podcast. Most of the time when I release an episode, it's usually me interviewing somebody else, or sometimes I'll do a solo podcast. This one is different. This is a recording of my friend Ruslan interviewing me. I was actually down at a studio in North County, San Diego, a couple weeks ago, and he interviewed me primarily on kind of LGBTQ related stuff. We talked about my forthcoming book, which releases tomorrow, actually, called "Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage?" That was kind of the launch point of our conversation. We got into lots of other stuff related to LGBTQ related questions. So this podcast is that recording. So it's Ruslan interviewing me. If you're not familiar with Ruslan, you should be. He is a widely popular YouTuber, Christian rapper, podcaster, and his show is really, really engaging. He does a great job both with the content production of it. He asks great questions. He's a great dialogue partner. I've really, really enjoyed following his show and is really honored to be on his show as a guest. So I don't know how to introduce this. Please welcome to the show me, or maybe Ruslan. Yeah, please welcome to the show for the first time, Ruslan interviewing Preston Sprinkle.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have an amazing guest today. He is a New York Times bestseller. I think he might be the first New York Times bestseller I've had in here. He is a doctor, but not the medical kind. And he is my 1/4 Armenian brother. All right. Without any further ado, we have Preston Sprinkles.
Thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you for being here. You've done a lot of work with this conversation around marriage, pronouns, the whole bit. And why? Why are you passionate about this topic? And can you put your mic just a bit closer?
So I would say I fell into the conversation about a decade ago, and it began as simply a scholarly pursuit. Like I wanted to figure out what I believed about the topic, primarily and same-sex marriage, and so I started just writing and researching, and and that led me into like dialoguing with a lot of people, and two things really quickly became kind of true in my journey. Number one, I grew up a conservative Christian, but have always like tried to take my beliefs back to the Bible and say, what does the Bible actually say? I don't want to just rely on my upbringing. I want to know for myself what the Bible says. I want to weigh all the options. And when I did all that, I did end up landing really strongly on a traditional view of marriage. To some people's chagrin, they saw that I was being very open-minded, and they were hoping I would be affirming, and I went the opposite direction. But then through that, I also saw that I think the church has done largely a pretty horrible job in how they've treated LGBT people. I mean, dozens and dozens of just really horror stories from LGBT people who grew up in the church and just had not just like a problem with the theological teaching of the church, but just relational stuff that I'm like, dude, that's just not Christian. You can hold to a traditional view and also be kind and loving and walk with people. And so that just kind of led to this kind of like me being passionate about being gracious and empathetic while holding to a traditional view of marriage. And some people say you can do one or the other. You can't do both. So I spent the last 10 years trying to disprove that. Yeah,
that's great. A quote from Jackie Hill Perry said that Preston's lived experience with the community, along with the theological depth he holds, makes this book a necessity. Regarding your last book, Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? What does she mean by your lived experience? It sounds like you've built a lot of bridges and have really connected with this. Is that kind of what Jackie's getting at in this quote?
Yeah. That is, I mean, there's been good scholarly work on the topic, obviously. So I would hope that I've contributed to that conversation as well in a healthy way. But I think what hasn't been done as much is, somebody who has, a scholarly approach to the topic, is doing research, who is also listening to stories and walking with LGBT people and spending time and building friendships and stuff. So that's been kind of what I've done from day one is keep this topic relational. Like I anytime I even, because my natural default is theology, right? Like I want to go to the Bible, I want to do word studies, I want to win debates, and like that's my default. So to not temper, but like maybe do that more holistically, I've had to really make sure I'm constantly in a relationship with LGBT people, so I don't just, because it'd be easy for me to just keep it as some topic to argue rather than as the title of my last book.
It's easy to dehumanize people
very easy.
when you forget that there's people. Now, do you think that the people are different from what some of us would say are the agendas by the activist? Because Dr. Michael Brown kind of hit me to that, and I was like, oh, that's good. I never really thought about it that way. There's the people, and this is their lived experience, and they're trying to figure it out. And some of them could even be like, look, I might be wrong on this in terms of the affirming crowd and that whole bit. But then there's like the visceral, like, hey, you can't opt out of social studies for your first grader regarding our history, right? Like this is happening in Glendale right now, where I'm not sure if you're keeping up with the protests, but they wouldn't allow the parents to opt out of elementary school teaching history and social studies around gay pioneers. And I'm just kind of like, huh? Like,
was that when the Armenian crowd got?
Oh yeah, you know what I'm saying. You know how the Armenians.
I've been around
down,
Armenians,
bro.
man. You don't tell Armenians how to parent their kids,
right?
No.
And so it's like I get the desire to humanize, but then there seems to be a disconnect between the humans and what seems to be the policy. That is not always reflective of the humans.
100%. I 100% agree. In fact, I would say, in my experience, and this is, I guess, anecdotal, but based on, a pretty large sample size, the overwhelming majority of actual LGBT people are not represented well by the very loud activist types. I would say, especially in the trans conversation, like the loud activists, the people you see on like What Is a Woman, the documentary, and those people exist for sure. They're very loud, very influential. So I don't want to downplay the significance of some of the ideology and the pressure and the political stuff. But I would say for every 10 trans people I talk to, maybe one might have that kind of activist spirit. Most of them are just some are politically conservative. In fact, I've got several trans friends who are like registered Republicans, or they don't even believe in same-sex marriage, or they don't believe they were born in the wrong body. Like one of my good friends would say, I have a neurological disorder and I just got kind of screwed by nature and I don't know why I had this, and transitioning was a last ditch effort to survive in their point of view. But they would turn around and say, I'm horrified at how all this ideology is being, pressuring teenagers and all the teen stuff going on. And so there's just such a wide diversity of just real human experiences among actual LGBT people. Yeah. I would say, in my experience, a small percentage of them would resonate with kind of that loud activist spirit.
Yeah. It also seems like the folks who are engaging with Christians tend to be a bit more charitable, right? Because if you're going to go and debate or discuss or have dialogue, you're probably going to be a bit softer than the folks that are driving. Which is interesting, because I think the one thing that the left does a great job, and I'm using the left in a very general, broad sense, is infiltrating institutions, right? So you have folks in these institutions that are like able to impact policy, and conservatives and Christians, like, we're kind of busy doing this thing. And so that's awesome that you can engage with people. And again, they're not the same as the folks who've infiltrated the institutions.
Yeah. That's when it comes to the institutional level, public schools, colleges, universities, it is very far left. Yeah. Especially in any kind of social science, kind of humanities area, not so much maybe on the engineering departments or whatever, but like, and it's you go on a university campus and it's going to be very far left. I think that, and these are the people that are, when they get out of these institutions, they're becoming influential people in policy and government and everything. Right. And so that's, I think it ends up becoming a very one-sided issue.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest misconception the average Christian has about the average person from that community?
Oh man, that's almost impossible to answer. I would say an assumption, kind of, I guess what we're kind of talking about. I mean, an assumption that all or most LGBT people are like this, and then usually that perception is based on kind of whether they're, if they're watching a lot of like conservative news, then they're going to usually highlight the extremes. And again, like have you seen a documentary, What is a Woman? Or
So I've watched a lot of the clips and I keep starting it. Like when they put it on Facebook, Twitter, me and my wife started it. And then like we just we didn't get into it because it was like I've seen a lot of the good parts, if you will.
Okay. So like that, like, he would highlight kind of some of these really extreme views that again are out there, and they are like, you hear some people talking like, do people actually believe this? Some people do, but the majority don't. So to answer your question, I think the biggest misconception is that when a lot of Christians think about LGBT people, especially if they don't have a lot of people in their life that are LGBT, they have kind of a one size fits all perception.
And then and that community is not a monolith.
It's not a monolith. Yeah. 500,000 statistically, according to one survey, 500,000 gay and lesbian people believe in a traditional sexual ethic.
Wait, how? Wait, by traditional sexual ethic, you mean?
Yeah, they're religious. They're mostly Christians, or maybe some might be, I don't know.
Meaning they're against marriage?
Yeah.
What?
They're same attracted, but they hold to a traditional view of marriage. Yeah. I just talked to a guy. He's a therapist here in San Diego, and he said he's probably counseled, I think, over 300 people in this area alone that have a religious commitment, same attracted, and for mostly theological reasons don't think it's right to act on it. So
it seems like there's a tension that we have to hold between the institutional influences or the agenda, which that sounds like we're about to throw on the Alex Jones, you know what I mean? And talk about the frogs being turned gay and all that stuff, right? So there's like this tension that we have to hold between the people influencing the institutions and writing the policy versus the average day-to-day person living their life. Yeah. And then to go deeper, the people who see this as, this is just who I am, this is what I'm attracted to, versus the people that are saying, oh, and you need to affirm this as the same. And so if we're not careful, we can slide into this like hyper paranoia that they're trying to get us.
Right.
You know?
Absolutely.
And not to say that there aren't, because there's definitely people that are trying to persuade, but I don't know if it's as common as we perceive it to be. Right. I don't know if it's as like, they're coming for your kids, right? Even though those videos of them saying we're here, we're queer, we're coming for your children. Right? There's those videos, but what do you make of all of that tension?
That's probably the hardest thing in the ministry that I do. I mean, this is my full-time job, is helping the church engage its conversation. So it's been interesting, and that I think helping Christians understand that you've got a lot of people probably in your church that are wrestling with their sexuality or gender on some level, that are scared to death to even talk about it. And they're sitting in your pew. So before you go and fight this policy or that, like, let's focus first on like shepherding our people well. And I think that's where, so there was a big survey done. It's the same one that was by Andrew Marin back about 10 years ago now. He did the largest, at that time, sociological study done on the religious background of LGBT people. It's published in a book called Us Versus Us, great book. And that survey showed that 83% of LGBT people were raised in the church.
Wow.
83%. That's crazy.
Whoa, that's a lot.
By the time they turn 18, about 51% end up leaving. But the main reasons why they say they left wasn't actually theological. It was all relational, So all that to say, like this whole, like, it's those people out there, and then we're the church in here. And people even talk about like gay people as if that's synonymous with like a raging atheist who hates Christianity or something. It's like, it's way more, that person does exist, but there's a lot more diversity within that community.
Yeah, that's good. What do you think, from your conversations, the LGBTQ community's biggest misconception of Christians is?
Yeah, that one's equally interesting. I think they think all Christians are like aggressively homophobic, transphobic, are into like conversion therapy. Are all Christian parents will kick their kid out of the house if they come out as gay. And I heard those stories exist for sure, and those people exist, and it's not a tiny number either. But in my experience, the overwhelming majority of Christians that at least I talk to, that hold to a traditional sexual ethic, they're they've got huge hearts for gay and lesbian people, and when their kid comes out, they actually have responded relatively well, or they might do unintentional things that maybe are hurtful, but not intentional. In fact, there's a story. I might not tell it exactly, so I'll say the name, but it was a college president in California, Christian college president, who was building a relationship with a gay activist, like a lobbyist, trying to like one of those activists that was the aggressive type, right?
Yeah.
Built a relationship, and man, he really broke through to him. But he says, "Hey, why don't you come visit our campus?" And the guy was scared to death because he thought that if he goes on a Christian college campus, Christians would be literally throwing rocks at him, trying to like beat him up with bats and stuff. Like so he was actually scared for his life.
Wow.
But the president's like, just come check it out.
Yeah.
And this is like, college students, dude. They're like, you're gay, so what? Like, it's not a big deal, And like, so he came on campus and he was so utterly shocked that people were kind to him. They were just nice. They just didn't. They kind of yawned when they found out. Oh, so he's a gay lobbyist. Whatever. Like, oh, great. Whatever. Like, what's your name? What's your favorite food?
Right.
So I think that misperception to all Christians are this, just kind of Westboro Baptist types. Like they're just aggressively after gay and lesbian people. So.
Yeah. It's interesting. I the folks in my life that are from that community that I've been close with. We don't sit down and like talk about their love life. Like we don't sit down and debate these things, like if they ask, I'll tell them what I think, which is what the Bible says.
Sure, yeah.
If they don't ask, like I'm not like prying, and it's more so about extending dignity and just having a relationship with the person, and then I think there's a desire for representation on both ends. Like I think Christians want a healthier representation in those circles, and I bet they would want a healthier representations amongst Christians, and how to navigate that. So it's interesting as I just I'm reflecting on that in my own life and how there's our brains naturally go to the most extreme caricature of the other side, instead of like, well, wait a minute, no. What's the average person like? Is the average person who's from this community gonna be the guy that forces you to make the cake, or forces you to make the website, or is that a smaller percentage that's trying to make an example because,
I think it's a smaller. Do you think it's? I think it's a lot smaller percentage.
I think it's a smaller.
I don't have data on that. But just in my experience.
For my experience, I would guess it, but it's obviously anecdotal.
Do you think it's what do you think is feeding these kind of extreme assumptions on both sides? Is it the polarized kind of way that news media is done these days, or like people believing extreme stories and thinking that's a norm, or where do you think that comes from, or just lack of relationship with people on the other side?
I think that's probably first is lack of relationship and lack of knowing people, and then I would say there's the convergence of different kind of worldviews and how those worldviews are articulated, and then I would say the media is definitely playing a huge role in. I think language, for example, right, like taking the word violence and changing it to mean something that it doesn't mean anymore.
Like what? Like verbal violence?
Like violence against LGBTQ bodies. I don't know of a lot of violence happening against anyone's bodies.
Right.
Like it's such a rare, but we'll take language and we'll change it. Genocide.
Yeah.
Right. We'll say language will change, and then it can just kind of mean whatever you want it to mean. And I think that can then you're gonna have you're just going to have an overcorrection on both sides. Even being told you have a phobia.
Yeah.
My wife has a real phobia of animals.
Really? Oh.
Okay. The other day, she was outside walking something to the recycling, and the neighbor's dog. The neighbor came across to say, like, oh, your recycling's full. Like, let me know if you want to use mine. And so as she's coming across, her dog runs over, and my wife jumps on the hood of her car.
Oh my gosh,
and my little 2-year-old sees it, and she's like laughing at mommy, right? That's a real phobia, like a real phobia where your body. And so even taking language like phobia, that's a phobia. You have a phobia. Like it instantly otherizes.
Trauma, violence. I mean, these are words. Like, so Yeah, I mean, you brought up genocide, so both of us have you more than a lot more than me, but some historical connection to the Armenian genocide. Like people that have been through actual violence, or we have friends that came over from America on the wake of the Rwandan genocide. They've been through trauma, right? They've experienced excessive violence. So if that same word that's used to describe that is now being used to describe, for instance, if I give a talk and show what that the Bible teaches that marriage is between a man and woman, I get accused of violence. We need a different word because those are two very different experiences. Isn't it kind of insulting to the person that has been through an actual genocide wait, you're comparing my situation with what you went through, hearing a viewpoint you disagree with?
Yeah. I don't want to speak on behalf of other groups, but I have black friends that have said this, like, hey, don't conflate this to civil rights. Like they're not the same thing. But I can only talk about from my experiences. Like I was with my dad last night and we were talking about the pogroms of Baku, which is the reason why we came out here. And so I'm Armenian, but we grew up in Azerbaijan, which Turkey, Azerbaijan all kind of used to be the Armenian kingdom. And what happened was there was Arzis that came back from Armenia saying that they were refugees and they were kicked out. And so as a response to that, the Arzis in Azerbaijan wanted to push all the Armenians out. And the Soviet Union gave all these regions autonomy, like they're like autonomous, like you're kind of like, it's like a nation state. And so by giving them this autonomous nature, they were allowed to mass export, tons of Armenians from Azerbaijan, from Baku, which is where I'm from. And my dad was telling me that they had to borrow, because again, the average Armenian and Arzi were friends, right? All in the same neighborhoods. My dad said they had to borrow their friends' police uniforms to get his dad and some other family members and put them in police uniforms and walk them through as they're trying to get to the train to get out of Baku. And in the process, they're talking Arzi instead of Russian or Armenian. And he said they're witnessing people get beat and killed and all this kind of stuff. That's a genocide. That's an attempt of a genocide. You're pushing. I don't know how many of us left Baku. So when I hear language like, the qualifier is like, do you think children should be allowed to get puberty blockers? Right. And I'm like, no. You're transphobic. That's genocidal. I'm like, no, stop. Like, what are we talking about? Like, that's not the same thing. And so I think that would frustrate anyone. Like, I think because then it becomes an overcorrection because I'm like, you guys are nuts. Like, this is crazy, right? But again, but it's hard to articulate that without coming across as you're now dehumanizing the whole group versus I have an issue with that ideology. I have an issue with an ideology that takes words and makes them mean something else. To your point, has the church been fair to LGBTQ people? Probably not. Right. Probably haven't
on the
been,
whole.
They haven't been the most gracious, probably haven't been the most charitable. We've probably looked the other way when we know that there are people who are sleeping with their girlfriends, living together, looking at porn, being sexually immoral in every other which way. Yeah. But when it came to this issue, the churches probably came down really hard on this thing. So yes, there's been some double standards in this regard. So I just feel like we are then we're talking past each other. Yeah.
It's a kind of a conversation stopper when the other person's accused of being violent or transphobic. Yeah. It's like there's no
or a groomer.
Or
when you come out and you're like groomer, like, whoa, that's a serious accusation,
right? Because you don't engage in a good faith dialogue with somebody who is an actual groomer or something. Right? It ends the conversation. Right. So, it seems to be getting worse. Do you think it's going to get better? I mean, you can't keep throwing around all these huge terms and accusations, and it's got to level out, don't you think? Or or it's just going to keep getting more and more polarized.
I think it's going to get worse.
Before it gets better. And what's
probably going to happen is through the election, I think it's going to get worse. I think all this is going to get more and more polarized. And then I think we'll probably I don't know, level out somehow. I don't know how, you know, but and I think you might see migration. I think you might see people move. You know, hey, if you're about this and you know you want to transit, you want your kid to transition, like you're gonna have to figure out a way to get out of Texas or get out of Florida. I think it's gonna get, you know, and same thing for people in California. Like if we start finding out like our tax dollars are going towards, you know, injecting kids with puberty blockers, like like how do we, you know, how do you navigate that conversation?
I think some of the extreme ideologies specifically in the trans conversation as it relates to youth, I think are going to be the thing that will end up, I don't want to say cannibalizing the what do I want to say? I think it's gotten too far out of hand, and you know it has when most older gay and lesbian people are like, we're not into this. Like this is not. And in a lot of European countries, which are more progressive than we are, they're rethinking it all because they've had a good number of females who were like, in their opinion, were rushed through transitioning as a teenager and now paying the lifelong effects of that as young 20-something. And we keep having these cases come up. There was a big one a couple of years ago in the UK that they actually won. Like they actually now lifted or they raised the age of puberty blockers because of this case, because she sued the I think the royal court and won. And so the whole gender like conversations is now like it's been kicked up so much. Now they're rethinking a lot of things. Same thing in Scandinavian countries, which are very progressive. They're rethinking a lot of things. So I think it's just a matter of time, especially, I mean, money talks. I mean, you get enough lawsuits where people are getting sued for engaging in surgeries that they probably shouldn't have done on teenagers. So I think my prophetic prediction, please don't take this with a grain of salt. I think in the next 2 to 5 years, there's going to be a scaling back on some of the extreme. I think it'll come down to how common does detransitioning become. If that's because right now the data they have is they're saying, oh, it's like 1%. You know, which is like it
seems like more than that.
It's way,
And so, but if it gets to like 50%, 40%, you know, I think that's when people will be like, okay, like we kind of overdid it on this whole thing. And it's so bizarre because it's all coming from a desire to be empathetic and to extend dignity and all this sort of thing. And it's just like inverted. It's like an inverted virtue that's sort of like, it's like quasi Christian almost.
If I was a steel man, so I'm with you, and we can even talk more about this, but you know, some of the trans conversation as it pertains to youth and medical or hormonally transitioning, like I think that's what makes me the most nervous. Like I'm very much not on board with that. But I think that youth aspect of this is going to change kind of the nature of the conversation. But I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. So you, I believe, at some point came out on pronouns, and that was controversial. And someone wrote an article. I covered. I don't remember who it was. So forgive me for not knowing the name. But some lady wrote an article and came down and said Christians who use pronoun, like they basically were like
trampling on the blood of Christ. Is one of the phrases.
I'm like, wait a minute. You know, to be fair, I've never been in a situation where I'm presented with, do I use the pronouns? Do I not use the pronouns?
Okay.
I would venture up to say I would probably just call that person by their name, whatever name they're asking me to call them, you know?
Yeah.
So unpack where you're at with the pronouns thing and how did you come to that conclusion?
Let me begin. There's been more recent articles on it, which is interesting. I published a book on the trans conversation called Embodied, and I have a whole chapter on like bathrooms, pronouns, and so on. And that was 2.5 years ago. And I've written on it before that. So this isn't, I don't know why it's flaring up now, but there's been some recent articles written that I think very much misrepresent or at the very least underrepresent my actual argument. Let me begin by saying I think it's complicated. I think this is not a black and white, here's the right response, here's the wrong response. It is very complicated because language is complicated. And interacting in a secular society with a Christian worldview where language is shared social space between me and my worldview and this person who has a completely different worldview, like the language is that's complex. That's a complex shared social space. So part of my goal is to help people to appreciate the complexity. So wherever you end up landing on it, be a little less dogmatic maybe, and be like, try to understand where somebody else is coming from. So I spent like 10 pages on this in my book. The first 5 pages is just that, like showing here's the good arguments for this side, good arguments for that side. You know, the big argument against pronoun use is, you know, you're lying to them, or you're, one of my friends says, I don't want to feed someone's delusion, you know, which I'm like, I get what you're saying. Maybe that phrase isn't, I've never won someone to Christ by calling them delusional, but the other side is that, you know, we're kind of meeting people where they're at, not demanding that they use language in a way that resonates with our worldview. And it's a give and take. Like, and there are certain, I'm a big fan of Orwell's 1984, you know, where language is, when people start manipulating language and forcing people to use terms, like I'm very concerned about that. I'm not naive to that. But on an interpersonal level, I have landed on the view, having thought through it, you know, that I will, in an attempt to meet someone where they're at, use the pronouns they want. Every single so let me say this, every single trans person that I know in my life that came to Christ and ended up either detransitioning, or some weren't fully transitioned anyway, who now are fine using their pronouns that match their biological, like now they're, you know, would identify with their biological. Hands down, every single one said if that was forced on me when I first came to Christ, or even not yet coming to Christ, I would have ran the other way. I needed space to wrestle, to be on a journey, to process this new way of thinking, you know, and Christians that didn't even go there with they just used my pronouns. I wanted to be around them, and then we walked to Christ together, and my discipleship started to mature, and then I ended up saying, yeah, maybe I should use pronouns that match my biological. So pragmatically, I can make a really good argument that I think it's better in most cases to use someone's pronouns. And I don't think it's necessarily lying to somebody unless I am saying I believe you, like, so if I meet a biological female, they want me to refer to them as they, them, or he, him. If I'm in relationship, I don't want to give the impression that I actually agree with their view of themselves, but I want to say, okay, I believe pronouns should match your biological. That's my worldview. It's what I believe, you know, hope you're okay with me believing that. Now, as a gesture of hospitality, this is obviously very important for you, so I will use your pronouns, but I don't want to give the impression that I am fully agreeing with everything they believe about themselves. So, and if they demand that I do agree with it, no relationship can be healthy if one party demands you agree with everything they believe, especially if it's something that's not accurate, you know, not scientific. So anyway,
I think
that's the short version of a very long complex.
I think the complicated part is even the non-binary. I was talking to a friend of mine, and we have a mutual acquaintance that I don't really speak to anymore, and they were telling me that they use this like we, they language. That's hard. You know? And he's like, we're on our way. And he's like, wait, who are you bringing with you? And he's like, no, bro, pronouns. And he's like, oh, my bad. You know? It's like, well, like if you're using this like we, they, you know, it almost becomes incoherent at times to even engage in a you know, like if I've like whenever you read an article about someone that identifies as non-binary and you're like, wait, they, like what, like hold on, and it's like, oh no, that's the person's pronouns. It's and I don't,
one of the biggest questions is how much of this is like medical and scientific and how much is social. And well, some people use the word trendy. Well, so, you know, my daughter was in a theater class a few years ago, you know, a bunch of 13-year-old girls, you know, and I think she said of the 15 kids, like 13 of them had alternative pronouns. Okay.
Wow.
Now, according to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the latest edition, 2013, 0.014% of people had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, like a clinical diagnosis. It's pretty rigorous. Like they have to match, I forget, 5 or 6 of 10 criteria to be diagnosed with this psychological condition. So when you have like, you know, 50 to 75% of say junior high girls using alternative pronouns, do they all experience clinically diagnosed gender dysphoria? I
Probably unlikely.
Probably unlikely.
Yeah.
Could it be socially in certain environments contagious? Call it trendy. Call it maybe just social influences at work. I mean, you gotta have your head in the sand to say, oh no, this is all just. So part of me is kind of like, it is difficult. I don't think, especially they them will catch on as kind of this normal societal thing. It doesn't. God, it's etched in the design of creation, male and female. Creation are binary. Okay, personalities aren't binary, but biological is binary. So I don't think it's gonna, in my opinion, last very long.
I went down the rabbit hole of the scholarly data we have on this specific conversation, and from what I read is that there's not a lot to support this idea that it's genetic, meaning that if you look at the brain with people who identify with the opposite gender, that there's nothing in their brain matter that shows that their brain is the opposite gender. So if you'd say like, because if this was real and objective and scientific, then you would take someone that's a trans man and their brain would look like, or aspects of his brain would look like a man's brain, right? And the only time that happens is after hormone replacement treatment.
Does the Bible support same-sex marriage? That's a question that many people are wrestling with today, and there's people who hold passionately to different answers to this question. Now, most dialogues about same-sex marriage, they end with divisiveness and confusion instead of clarity and a better understanding of the other person's position, and even a better understanding of your own position. This is why I wrote a book titled, Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? 21 Conversations from a Historically Christian Perspective, which comes out in August this summer. So what I do in this book is I first talk about how Christians should even go about having, a profitable conversation about contentious issues. I really want us to cultivate a better posture in how we even go about defending our points of view or trying to refute others. I then lay out a biblical and theological case for the historically Christian view of marriage. And then for the rest of the book, I take what I see as the top 21 arguments for same-sex marriage, and I respond to each one in a way that's both thoughtful and thorough. Some of these arguments are, since some people are born gay, then God must allow for same-sex marriage, or, the word homosexual was only recently added to the Bible, or the traditional view of marriage is harmful to gay and lesbian people, and many other arguments that I wrestle with in this book, Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? So if you're looking for a theologically precise and nuanced approach to these arguments, one that doesn't, straw man the other view to make it look bad, then I would encourage you to please check out my book, Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? You can order it now on Amazon or wherever books are sold.
So it's like they have to get on testosterone and inject themselves to then develop the characteristics and the brain differentiation. But what is it, the therapy called? The hormone
replacement therapy. Or There's
no brain difference of a trans brain versus a non-trans.
It is complicated. I have a whole chapter on, it's called the brain theory.
Yeah.
And in my book on trans called Embodied, I have a whole chapter, and I spent more time researching for that chapter than any other chapter I've ever written in my entire life, because there's been data for, because it's linked to the question that's a 100-year-old scientific question on, do men and women have different brains?
Right.
Even that. There's general differences in things, but you don't. The consensus seems to be that our brains in general are not sexually dimorphic like our bodies are.
Yep.
There are general patterns of difference.
Yep.
But they're kind of based on stereotypes too. Like,
there's definitely stereotypes, but there's also the reality of just testosterone.
Yeah. Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like testosterone
that affects your.
So if you have a guy and the average man is walking around with 10x the testosterone of the average woman, which is, if you have a healthy dose of testosterone, that's what it is. That's a huge difference in terms of how you're going to navigate, operate, your degree of competitiveness, your aggression, your drive, like all of that stuff is going to be different. Now, to your point, how much can that be shown on a brain scan? Apparently, from the article I saw, that they see it, the brain changing post the hormone therapy.
It's hard because there's been a lot of studies done on it, and they're all can be very highly politicized. So it's almost like you have to read 10 studies and get get the rare get a scientist who doesn't have a dog in the fight, which is
Sure,
pretty rare.
sure.
And but yeah, having combed through all those, there doesn't even the ones that did argue for brain differences, they're I think they overreach in both their methodology and like that. Is this post transition, post testosterone? Is it, or even, you know, our brains are elastic. Like New York cab drivers, there was a study done on New York cab drivers that their hippocampus, I think, is bigger than the average person because life actually reshapes your brain and restructures your brain.
Wow.
So it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. Like, did living as a trans identity, is that because of your brain, or did that actually reshape your brain? And it's like almost impossible to tell. So I think people are starting to back off some of the brain studies because it's just, you can't really prove much from it. But.
Yeah. Now, it sounds like a lot of what your work does is just advocate for extending dignity and empathy to people from this community. Is that a fair
I would
way?
say half of what I do is that. The other half is theologically defending, articulating, responding to questions around same-sex marriage and same-sex sexuality.
Your background in terms of your doctorate is in New Testament studies, right? So your background is in that, and so half of it is, hey, we need to extend empathy and love to these people. We need to not otherize them and discard them. And then the other half is almost like an apologetic for a Christian ethic.
Yes. And I'm not a debater. I'm not an apologist like you are, but I get questions all the time. So in fact, the book that just came out or is coming out, Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? It is me responding to all the counter arguments to the traditional view. So
what are some of those counter arguments?
Like,
there's 21 in the book.
21 in the book.
Yeah. What are the most popular? We don't have to go over all 21.
Yeah. One of the most popular ones is that when the New Testament writer, specifically Paul, prohibits same sexual relationships, the only kind of relationship that was available in the first century were relationships of power and abuse and older men on younger boys. And
he's
so,
really condemning pedophilia. He's not condemning what is it? A monogamous, covenantal relationship.
Right. Yeah. That one it used to be popular among scholars till they realized the data doesn't really support it. But I still hear it.
As if they did not have monogamous relationships in antiquity.
Well, and to be fair, when it comes to male same-sex relationships, if you look at Greco-Roman literature, you look at the environment, the overwhelming majority were between men of power differences, rape, abuse, master slave, older man, younger boy. The majority are, but there's exception. Well, number one, there's exceptions to that. Number two, female same relationships were the opposite. It was between consenting adults. So in Romans 1, Paul leads with female same relationships and then says likewise the men. So the fact that he also prohibits female same relationships shows that we can't be exclusively thinking of domineering, kind of abusive. And there's nothing in Paul's language. He isn't concerned about age differences when he talks about these relationships. So
and then I've also heard, and it's Romans 1, and he says it's shameful. Yeah. In the same way that it is shameful for a man to have long hair. That's the word that they're using. So he's not saying it's a sin. He's just saying, it's shameful. That's an argument I've heard.
Yeah, that's right, because he does bring in nature when it comes to long hair in 1 Corinthians 11.
Right.
So that's one argument. Another one is that, one of the ones that comes up is like, well, what about like polygamy in the Old Testament, or like this whole idea of a biblical marriage is kind of super messy all over the Bible, So like why pick on this one or whatever? But it's kind of like a red herring a little bit. It's kind of like, well, it's messy everywhere. So, but I'm like, well, yeah, but if you go back to creation, Genesis 1 and 2, yes, even polygamy was a departure from the creational design. That's Jesus's point in Matthew 19, right? Right. From divorce was allowed or whatever, because of the hardness of your heart. But from the beginning, it was not so. Like Jesus's ethic goes back to the creational design. So that's what we need to do. Follow Jesus's example. So love is love is an argument. Probably the most popular one isn't the traditional view of marriage harmful toward gay and lesbian people? And that's probably the longest response because I wanted to look at both the logic of the argument and also even like sociologically, because people often cite studies of, to try to prove that. So
saying traditional view of marriage.
Yeah.
I believe in a one man, one woman
Yeah.
relationship covenant. Everything else is out. Friends with benefits are out.
Yep.
Being married in your heart is out.
Yep.
Telling
Polyamory,
you, God saying it's okay for you to sleep with your girlfriend is out. All of it is out. Porn, masturbation, all of it is out. And they say that holding to a one man, one woman marriage is harmful towards same-sex marriage.
Yes. It's harmful towards somebody who is gay, is attracted to the same, and is trying to follow Jesus. Like somebody who's exploring Christianity, is in a Christian environment, maybe they're committed to Jesus, that if they're told that they cannot marry somebody and have sex with somebody that matches their orientation, then that's harmful. And I give several responses to that. One of the things it kind of does though is it kind of resurrects purity culture type stuff that like until I get married and have like I just can't be a happy person, a fulfilled person. So so I kind of addressed that a little bit in that argument that because to say it's harmful means let's just broaden that logic out. It means if I'm not married to the person I desire, I can't live a flourishing, happy life. Now, purity, we definitely sent that message loud and hard.
Yeah, we tried that
throughout purity culture, and we messed a lot of people up.
Yep.
So and the main question isn't, does this seem like a harmful thing? The main question really is it true? Did the Creator who designed us to be sexual beings, what is his design, and how do we know? So try to take us back to Scripture.
Yeah. What do you feel is? Do you think the argument just strictly from natural law is one of the strongest arguments? Obviously, what Jesus says is ultimately the final.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The argument. Romans 1. Hard to argue with Romans 1 when there's specific acts being discussed, right? But I think just the practicality of us reproducing as a species to continue our species sounds like a fairly straightforward, hey, natural law just points us in this direction. And that seems like the strongest argument. And I have a rebuttal to it that I'll share with you later.
Yeah.
But what do you think about that? Just on the surface.
So a lot of Catholic scholars have done great work.
Yeah, I was thinking St. Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah. And one more recently, Ryan T. Anderson is a conservative Catholic scholar who argues for traditional marriage without quoting the Bible, like it's all natural law, and it's a good argument. I think for me, I do think that special revelation resonates with general revelation, that God's revealed design and the Word will also resonate with creation. We see this in wisdom literature, especially where you're drawing on creation. Go to the ant, you sluggard. You can see that God has wired creation in a way to reflect his design. So I agree with all that. For me, in terms of like an argument, I do see reliance simply on natural law. There's too many exceptions to the rule that make it difficult, I think, for an argument, because I think a lot of the intelligent, more progressive people that I talk to, they always point out exceptions, infertility, marriage and old age, or like, should we even have contraceptions, so there's always these kind of like exceptions to the rule that I think they just kind of throw a wrench sometimes if you're relying on natural law solely as an argument.
Not solely, but just looking at the design of the body parts.
Yeah.
And just go, it looks like this was designed in a way. Oh, and a baby comes.
Yeah.
And obviously not every time the act happens, a baby has to come, but it's pretty straightforward. The only rebuttal I've really heard to that, obviously there's the, what you pointed out, which is like, well, what about old age? What about this? Well, it's, the plumbing is still the same, even if there's not a baby that comes with that. But I've heard like, well, it's not in nature all the time. There's these animals that exhibit these other things. Yeah. And I'm like, but that doesn't, humans are different.
Are we going to take our sexual ethic from watching animals?
Right. Because animals do all kinds of weird stuff. And some animals eat their own poop. There's all kinds of bizarre things that happen with animals. So I've heard that as like but there's these kind of animals that exhibit this as well, and I'm like, but that's a little different than humans,
Yeah, I mean, we can get into details. We probably don't even want to wander into like specific, like sexual acts or whatever. And
Sure.
but yeah, so I would agree that the human body does reflect God's design as revealed in Scripture that resonates with the traditional view of marriage. It is those exceptions to the, Yeah.
So let me ask you this, and we're going to go to some questions from the Patreon community here. I see the chat, so if you guys got questions, feel free to drop them in. How does a Christian engage with the idea of marriage, right?
Yeah.
Because some Christians have taken a more libertarian approach of like, well, this doesn't really affect my marriage. So what does it matter if they're allowed to legally get married?
So in terms of the legal question.
Question, right?
Yeah.
And then there's also others that have been like, yeah, well, we took our hand off this and allowed this to happen. And now they're trying to teach to first and second graders in the social studies class the history and how this is the same as heterosexual marriage, right? So where do you land on that? Is it like, do you take a more libertarian approach of like, yeah, it doesn't really affect Christians.
Yeah.
Let them get married. Or do you say, yeah, but when we open the doors to this, or like it's not optimal to allow this legally to happen? What would you say?
My response is both wet cement and maybe complex. So I'm not going to have a real black and white passionate response, because I think it really deals. Well, we would first need to deal with what does it mean to be a Christian living in a secular society? What is our role, our influence in living in a secular society? I think sometimes, are we trying to take America back for God? Was it ever for God? Are we, or as I say, are we exiles in Babylon? And when Babylon does Babylonian things, are we kind of like, well, it's Babylon. What do you expect? You know, I would lean more
to the latter.
At the same time, I do believe that God's created design is good for creation. So when nations, when peoples depart from the Creator's design, that will not go well, generally speaking. So do I think legalizing marriage is actually good for a society? No. Did I freak out when it was legalized in 2015? Not really. I kind of yawned in a sense, because I'm like, it's hard enough to live out my Christian faith with the Spirit of God. People that aren't even coming with a Christian ethic, like, it's not shock. Maybe that's what it is. It's not shocking to me when secular people live out a secular ethic.
Yes.
So that's the tension I battle, and yet I do think the Creator's design is good for creation, but I assume most of creation won't follow that. You know. So, what do you? I would love, because I mean, you think more about that intersection of politics and faith and stuff. So I can be convinced either.
I
can. So let me say, I can never vote for something that doesn't resonate with God's design.
Absolutely.
That's.
Well, I'm in California, and the fact that in 2008 California banned it when we voted for it, which is really,
that's odd.
This is a trip. Check this out. We banned same-sex marriage in 2008.
Is that Prop 8?
Prop 8.
Yeah.
And we voted in a teenager's right to have an abortion without their parents' knowledge.
In the same year?
The same year, the same vote. So talk about how wild California was at that time, right? Like, we're okay with 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds having abortions and the parents not needing to know, right? Versus, but we were against this as a state, right? Which is really interesting. So I voted against both. I was like, this is both bad. It's both evil. I think there's a tension, legally speaking, if two consenting adults in a pluralistic secular society want to be together, should they not have the rights to, file jointly on their taxes? Should they not have the right to bedside death rights or whatever? Right? There's certain legalities. Having a retirement plan that can be taken. You know what I mean? Like all those things. I think there's a precedent to say, hey, I can't let my faith dictate the legality of other people's relationships. That doesn't seem right? And I would acknowledge that. I don't think that's fair to folks in that type of environment, what they want to do within their personal lives. And then I go, yeah, but you know what? Jesus said, it's like,
like trying to force a Christian ethic on
Yes. Now, in terms of like calling it marriage, I definitely think that that's a bit tricky, you know. But I also can see the argument that like we've called a lot of goofy things marriage, you know. There's a lot of folks that shouldn't be getting married that are getting married, but in their natural state, they could at least come to Jesus and then continue staying married and work on their marriage, and that could bring immense glory to God at some point. Whereas if someone's in the same marriage, there's no real room for that, right?
Yeah.
And then it gets even more complicated if there's kids involved and all. You know what I mean? Then I'm just like, holy moly, man! There's just layers on layers. So I would tend to be of the position that there should be some legal protections allowed, while saying let's not call this marriage because that's not what this is.
That seems reasonable to me. Now, like I would probably lean libertarian on most questions that deal with ethical questions. But yeah, with marriage, we are now dealing with something that is primarily, first and foremost, a profoundly theological institution. This is where I would prefer that the state would stay out of the marriage conversation. You know?
But the state doesn't, and to be fair, the state rewards families and it rewards having kids to certain degrees. Like there's definitely an incentive structure, whether it's taxes or whatever. So that's where I go. I just that's complicated. You know, so like if the state is going to be involved, what should they be rewarding? In my opinion, they should be rewarding people staying married longer, having more kids, like there should be practical things that we should be rewarding if the state's going to reward anything. That's kind of how I would like.
So for you, it's just calling it marriage, like call it a civil union, and then
which is where I thought we were all at. I thought everyone was on the same page. Joe Biden, Obama, Hillary. I think everybody was like, they got civil unions, they'll be fine. Right. And then all of a sudden it was like, no, it has to be marriage, and it's like, okay, so now you're saying it's the same. It's not the same. Let's not call it the same. It's not the same. It's not the same. You know, so that's kind of how I look at it.
It seems to me some of the more radical feminists, many of whom are also lesbians, would almost agree that like they see marriage as a whole a heteronormative institution anyways. Like why are we fighting to be crammed into this conservative institution anyway? Like let's just do our thing.
I don't get it. I really don't get it. I think it goes back to that line between acceptance and affirmation. I could accept you, I can love you, I could have you over for the barbecue, we can go do activities together, we can hang out, but there's a line between like I accept these things about you versus like I now have to affirm these things about you. If I go to my family's house and they have a couple too many drinks, I could accept that. I'm Armenian, for crying out loud. You know, it came from the Soviet Union. Like they drink. But I got to affirm that, you know? I got to go out of the way and say, yeah, you should have another glass of wine while I'm sitting there not drinking anything. Like it doesn't make any sense to me, right? And so like if I don't affirm everything about my own family, what makes you think I'm going to affirm this thing that what you want to call a marriage?
What does that look like? Like for you, would you not refer to, say, a same couple as husband and husband, or would you not use marital language, or would you just concede and say, well, this is the secular society we're living in, so I'm just going to, even though I don't agree with it, I'll just kind of.
Oh, that's a good one. I think it goes back to pronouns, right? Like I would probably say partner. Okay. Partner, right? I don't know if I would say husband. That's an interesting question. I've never really thought about it. Again, I haven't been presented with a lot of these dilemmas and how to practically deal with them, you know?
I think a lot of them involve a lot of gray area, and that's what I think we all should appreciate, that we're dealing with this complex interaction, Christians living in a secular society. You know?
Yeah. And so, I don't know. I think it's interesting. What do you make of the affirming theology? And Zach always says a little bit of Jesus is better than no Jesus. Right? Like if there's a little bit of Jesus they're hanging on to by a thread, then it's better than no Jesus. But then the argument could be made that it's a counterfeit Jesus. Is it the Jesus of the Bible, right? If you're holding on to this Jesus that allows you to do anything and live any kind of way, right? Yeah. Is that the authentic Jesus?
That's another. I go back and forth on that. I would probably lean more towards the latter, that having if it's a distorted view of Jesus. No, so I want to make a distinction here between, like, I know people who are affirming, they affirm same-sex marriage, but everything else about their theology, their life would feel very just almost evangelical, you know? They talk about the gospel, they talk about repentance. They just have a disagreement on this ethical question. Now I'll be the first one to say, this is a significant disagreement.
Yeah.
This is chapter 20 in my book. Is this an agree to disagree issue? And I say, I don't think it is. I think this is a very important part of the storyline of Scripture. Is the basic essence of what marriage is.
Yeah.
So it's not a minor disagreement, but if somebody says, I get this question a lot, parents saying my kid's affirming, and they want to go, the only kind of church they can go to is an affirming church. Is that a good thing? You know? And I want to make a distinction. If it's a kind of church where Jesus is hardly mentioned, it's just a social club, there's no residue of the gospel at all. I almost see that as more dangerous. Better to not, versus maybe an environment where they are hearing the word of God. They're not getting just affirming messages every Sunday, you know. But I say, okay, that I think is probably better than no church at all. But to be in a church where the gospel is just either so distorted, I think that can almost be worse than not being a church at all, personally. But I could change my view tomorrow. I don't know.
Yeah. I got a buddy that I'm going to have on that more or less affirms all the essentials of Christianity and the early creeds, but he is affirming. Yeah. I'm just like, I don't know what to do with you, man. Like, I don't know what I categorize. Now, I think this is a parallel, so forgive me if sounds like I'm all over the place, but I think someone that doesn't affirm Jesus as God Almighty is following a counterfeit Jesus, right? So if you're like, Jesus was a lowercase g God. Yeah. Jesus was created. Jesus is not God eternal. Jesus is not Yahweh, right? I think I go, ooh. Right. That's tricky because we see Jesus taking on all the attributes of God Almighty repeatedly. You see Hebrews 1 refer in the Psalm that Hebrews 1 is referring to. It's Yahweh talking to Yahweh, right? And so we see this. So I would go, man, if someone is not affirming Jesus as Yahweh, they're probably following a counterfeit. And I would hope that they would repent and land in the right place. So that's where I go with this issue. It's a tricky one because you might be following the Jesus of Yah, like the Jesus is God Almighty, but this is such a huge kind of distinction that people make with their theology, and it becomes tricky.
Yeah, in most cases. Again, anecdotal, but like in my experience, when evangelical churches shift their view on marriage, in many cases at least, I've seen they do. And I'm not a slippery slope guy. I don't like always using the argument. In this case, it is again anecdotally mostly true that other, I would say, important theological commitments end up kind of going by the wayside. Yeah, in my experience,
I've seen people start from this point and then get to the point of the bodily resurrection even happened. I don't know, maybe it was a metaphor, you know. Oh, okay, we've completely deconverted off the rails. You know? Man, I don't know how they consist, like again, not trying to use a slippery slope as an argument, but just as a logical deduction. Like I don't know how you can affirm marriage and not also affirm polyamory more than multiple partners consensual in a marriage. If it all comes down to harm and consent, and if this is a consenting threesome, foursome, or whatever, what makes, you've already said that when the two become one flesh, it doesn't need to be male and female. Why does it need to be two anymore? Then, so I used to say this a few years ago, and people were like, slippery slope, you're just fear monger. I'm like, but now it's like I'm getting the same people saying, oh, I'm having what we were going through with the LGBT conversation 5 years ago, we're now going through with polyamory because we're getting thruples and people coming to church now and claiming this is an orientation and this is how God made all the same kind of arguments. So I see that way more prevalent. I see that a lot more prevalent, especially in the men's rights spaces. I don't know if you're familiar with the red pill and all that. I mean, there's a lot of dudes out there that feel entitled because they think they're a high value man to have multiple partners. And that's, I mean, it's borderline going mainstream.
Is that like Andrew Tate?
Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate. And then there's like this weird overlap with Islam, because you could have in certain of Islam, you could have up to 4 wives. And so there's some overlap there, but no, there's a lot of guys that are like, I mean, I feel like I can take care of multiple women. What's the big deal? And that's definitely being more and more mainstream. I got a buddy an acquaintance who was in a situation where they attempted that because he found out that the person he was with was, had same attractions.
Mhm.
And so they attempted this like scenario, and it just blew up and was really, 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 really bad. And
That's the most common scenario that I've seen is usually like a heterosexual. Oftentimes it's been a guy and his wife or girlfriend comes out as bisexual and says, I need a same partner to fulfill. So it becomes kind of a same relationship and then an opposite. And then it can kind of go anywhere in many different directions from there. But
I think those aren't going to end well. But let me bounce this off you. This is an interesting one. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. So there are parts of the world, and I think Got Questions did an article on this. So this is not me like pontificating off of but Got Questions, which is a fairly conservative site, had an article about polygamy and how there are parts of the world where polygamy is legal, and there is a gentleman who has multiple wives, gets saved, and the question becomes, does he need to end those? and how does he end those? And how does he, is it the first one that's the only one, or is it his favorite? Right? Like, is it the one where the kids are the smallest? Right? How do you navigate that conversation? And I got questions. I should really look this up so to make sure I don't misquote them. But Got Questions basically landed at like, it's kind of a question of conscience for him and his environment. Can he financially provide for all of them? Are they all okay? And what do you think of that? While you answer that, I'm gonna look it up just to make sure I'm not butchering questions.
I actually had a friend of mine, missionary, who was a missionary to northern Nigeria back in the 60s, and apparently, I don't know if it's still the case, but it was a polygamous society, and he faced this exact question. He had people coming to Christ who had multiple wives, and so he had to wrestle with it. One of the things he said is that what makes this complex is it's so etched into the fabric of society. You're not dealing with just some individual living in some sinful life. You're dealing with the whole the fabric of society. And you mentioned it in passing. It's not that he's just it's not like primarily even a sexual thing. It's a power thing. It's also a prestige thing. It's also an economic thing. He's got these women who are being supported financially, and if he just dropped them all, you would have this huge other issue. So the mediating position they took is, I think they worked towards, I don't know if it was like an instant, like here's the demand, but it was working towards him having one of his wives as a sexual partner. So he's being sexually faithful to her, abiding by a sexual ethic, but not divorcing the other women, but just keeping them, like supporting them, So they're still living in the house, they're doing household chores and everything. Because that was another thing he said, oddly enough, in his experience, it was the first wife who asked for another wife because in a very patriarchal kind of culture, she had all this housework, all this stuff, and she just wanted help. She also wanted someone to talk to, because in that culture, it wasn't like the husband's coming home listening to her feelings. And so it wasn't, it was complicated, man. It was, so you have to understand the cultural and societal complexity of it. But I think that's probably the approach I would take. Trying to balance being faithful to a Christian ethic, but also
be intimate with one wife.
Yes, and who do you pick? Well,
let's look at what Got Questions says. So this is a trip. So let me show you the question real quick. This is I wasn't expecting this answer. I think they're more progressive than you are. And Got Questions is extremely conservative. If a man has multiple wives and became a Christian, what is he supposed to do? So if a man has multiple wives and became a Christian, what is he supposed to do? If polygamy is illegal where he lives, he should do whatever is necessary to submit to the law while still providing for his wives and children. If polygamy is legal, but he is convicted that it is wrong, he should divorce all but one wife. Again, he must not neglect providing for all of them and their children.
So the divorce he's still providing, he's just technically not married. Okay.
Yeah. They are his responsibility. If polygamy is legal and he has no conviction against it, he can remain married to each of his wives, treating each one with love, dignity, and respect. A man who makes this decision would be barred from church leadership, but it cannot be said that he is an explicit violation of any command in Scripture.
Yeah, I disagree with that last part,
But it cannot be said that he is in violation. So you would disagree with that?
I would disagree with that because I think people take kind of and I don't want to assume this about the author or whatever, but like they take kind of a flat view of Scripture of like, well, it's allowed in the Old Testament, and it's not outrightly condemned in the New Testament except for, you can't be an elder, right? For Timothy, Titus. But again, I think the allowance in the Old Testament was a departure from the creational design, and Jesus under the new covenant takes us back to the creational norm. So rather than looking for, is it commanded like as in thou shalt not, we also need to look at just God's design as a whole, rather than is it sin, not sin, is there command, is there chapter verse?
Yeah.
Clearly,
what is the virtue ethic being preached, not what is the letter of the law?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's
good.
So I think the command isn't in the form of a command in the Greek language specifically, but when Jesus takes us back to creation, saying one man, one woman, one flesh union, I think that's the standard,
Well, you're more conservative than Got Questions, my friend. Got Questions is out here saying, look, man, if you ain't convicted, live and let live.
I hope I'll get back-to-back emails accusing me of being too conservative, being too liberal. Like it's so funny. I'll hear assumptions about what people think I believe. I still have people to this day that think I affirm marriage. I've written 2 or 3 books saying not that, So anyway, it's funny. So for my audience that thinks I'm going liberal, there you go.
Yeah, it's an interesting question though, right?
It is. It's really good. Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna go to some of these questions, and then I want to ask you an offline question that's probably way too spicy.
Okay.
For YouTube. Okay. If I have a Christian or Catholic LGTB people, we say LGTB because we can't say LGBTQ on live on YouTube. Do that?
I was wondering why.
Yeah, and I have an affinity for LGTV TVs. All of our TVs are LGTVs.
I did not know that. That makes a lot of sense. I was like, how do you not know the acronym when I'm listening to your
we speak in code, yeah. LGBT people, what books should I direct them for the softest approach? Or what is the best scripture to be gracious but firm in stance?
I mean, I abhor self-promotion. Okay?
It's okay.
But I would say other people, if I can get in this head of how other people answer this question, I think my book, People to Be Loved, is exactly that. It's a theological exploration. So it's like 70% like working through the text, but woven throughout is loads of stories that we've shared. I mean, the whole first chapter, people thought I was going Affirming because I was talking about gay people committing suicide in the church and we need to do better, all this stuff. And then I said, okay, let's look at what Scripture says. So yeah, it has been kind of a go-to book for people under that category.
That's good.
Yeah,
that's good. Okay, well there you go, you guys. Matthew, pick up the latest. What was that book called?
People to Be Loved. Why is not just an issue is the subtitle.
That's good. Okay, this is a question I have for you. What do you make of Andy Stanley being ambiguous on this question and seemingly saying some things privately?
Yeah.
With we've had multiple elders come out and say this is what he said privately. He's open to doing one of these marriages, but publicly he says don't take people's church from them by coming out as affirming. You got to be wise. And it seems like he's kind of playing both sides, and then seemingly there's some affirming theology around kids that come out in the church. Seemingly, I don't want to speak too firmly, and so it's like it seems like he kind of wants to play both sides of it. I don't think that serves the people of his church well. If he's on the kind of like this ambiguous position, and I don't think it serves that community well if they're not sure exactly where he lands on it. Okay. What say you?
So let me give a few qualifications up front. Number one, I don't think I've read more than 20 pages from Andy Stanley book. I maybe listened to a couple messages, so I don't follow him. From what I've heard and seen, from what I have seen, have a lot of respect for him as a Christian leader, as a communicator. He's off the chart from what I've seen, and I've known people that have known him personally, and some of the criticism he's gotten I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt. I'm like, I don't know if he quite said that. Like, I think you're taking that in the worst possible direction.
Yep.
So I find myself in my heart, at least, kind of like, well, it's maybe more standing up for him. Even the recent clip that went around, that 2-minute clip from something he said about gay people having more faith than other. I'm like, if I look at the heart of what he's trying to say there, I'm like, I probably agree with what he's trying to say there. Like,
if a gay person is coming to a church they know is not affirming, that shows a lot of faith.
Yeah,
right? That's kind of,
or even like,
because I could hear it that way. I understand what you're saying.
And I think he was even saying like, look, if I ask for volunteers, and he didn't make a distinction affirming or not. He's like, I'll ask the church and I get hardly anybody, and I'll ask gay people and I get lines out the door. People don't want to serve. And I think it was almost like this, like, hey, you people who are all, criticizing gay people, like, well, you step it up because they're the ones jumping in. Anyway, I in my best reading of that, I was like, okay, I think he's saying a lot of things here that I wouldn't disagree with. And so having said all that, I think I think it could be absolutely more clear. And I've been around this conversation enough. It feels like so many people I know that were raised conservative, and then they kind of, their eyes are open to how the church has really messed up gay people, and then they go affirming. I'm not saying he's that. I don't know enough. I'm not saying he will be that. I'm saying he looks like he's doing just that because he doesn't have that theological clarity, to my mind, that he's at least publicly expressing in the clips and stuff that I've seen. I would say my biggest concern, or just something I'm just not really impressed with, is his church is hosting a conference on parents with LGBT kids. Okay. And our organization has produced resources. A huge part of our ministry is helping parents navigate this. But last time I checked, most of the speakers at that conference were all very publicly and some pretty aggressively affirming. I would go so far, and I've hosted some of these like scholarly debates where you have people on this side, that side, and I'm not against having diversity of opinion under a certain format, but I didn't see much diversity here. There was like one kind of conservative person, but they weren't a theologian. But then now all these like theological equipped people who are affirming. I'm like, this is utterly unless you're just appealing to parents who are affirming or whatever. If that's what you're doing, then say it, and I could disagree with, but respect kind of what you're doing. But this just looks utterly confusing, and I think it's very unwise. I've had people that in my ministry say, parents with gay kids saying, I was incredibly disappointed. This is not helpful for a parent when there's not theological clarity. And again, if you're affirming, then be affirming.
Right.
But when you say you're not affirming and then host a conference with a ton of affirming speakers who are going to sway the audience, like you're going to get an affirming perspective, then I just don't think that's helpful at all. So
yeah, I hear you. I saw that same conference thing, and I was like, man, and I've read Andy Stanley's Deep and Wide. I thought it was a really good work.
Yeah.
I read Communicating for a Change.
That's the one I read. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. So he's done a lot of really good work. So I was kind of taken aback when he's like, I'm hearing all this stuff, and then you're seeing kind of like the breadcrumbs of like,
Yeah.
I'm really just like, man, just come out and own it. Like, if this is what you're on.
I hope it's not this. I hope it's not closeted. He's affirming, but he would lose a ton of people and money and church building. I hope it's not power and money and platform and size of church that is preventing him from coming out as affirming. I just don't have. I can imagine that would be a hard decision, but I'm like, again, like you said, just if this is where you're at, then be where you're at, and I can agree to disagree, But I think the unclarity is clarity is kindness, and this is a big thing in when I help leaders work through this. I'm like, wherever you're at, just be consistent and be clear.
Amen.
When you're not clear, it's not people. It just confuses people. So
yeah, that's good. Okay, I got 2 offline questions I want to ask you. Shout out to Memes for Jesus for just joining the stream. He said Preston is the GOAT. That's my guy. Do you have anything else you want to hit on the public section of our conversation?
I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay.
But encourage people to check out my latest book. I wrote it to help yeah, I think there's so many people were coming to me saying, how do I respond to this? How do I respond to that? What about this? I'm reading this argument. I heard the word was added to the Bible, 80 years ago. Is that true? So I wrote this as a resource to help people respond to those questions.
That is, the original word was effeminate men, which is probably harsher than right?
All of them are. So the Greek words arsenokotes and malakoi in 1 Corinthians 6:9, and there hasn't been a great English translation of those two Greek terms until the last decade or so. The CSB, ESV, and CSB do a good job. The new NIV does a good job. Anyways, it's
what would be a better translation?
A male who is having with another male.
Okay.
Yeah, or a man having with another male is what I would say.
Someone that is practicing.
Is engaging in a same relationship. And this is where a lot of people's concern, this is my concern with conservatives, they'll quote this passage saying, see, gay people won't inherit the kingdom of God. I'm like, well, this isn't talking about gay people, as in my friends who are committed to celibacy out of allegiance to Jesus, but would still refer to themselves as gay. It's not talking about that. It's talking about somebody who is in an unrepentant, active, same sexual relationship. Or opposite. I mean, the whole passage talks about all kinds of ongoing unrepentant sin. So,
yeah, that's good.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.